Hi Wind Ensemble! Thank you for viewing this video. Today we're going to learn how to practice and different practice methods. This is basically the most important topic that you can learn as a musician because that's how we get better. So it's very important that you take notes because when we come back to school, I will check your practice journals so I will know if you used these practice methods or not. And due to the nature of this topic, we are going to have a group discussion because each of us is going to have a different experience and we're going to have different specific things that we do to get better when we practice. So there's basically three types of practice. The first one is the interpretation phase. That's where you're first learning a new piece and you're figuring out how you want your performance to sound, figure out the mood, the character, everything. And then the second phase is the building or adjustment phase. That's where you build up your technical ability. That's the phase that we usually all get stuck in. And the third practice type is performance practice, which is sadly neglected, but this is where you practice performing your piece. You could practice performing the first 30 to 60 seconds without stopping, even if you make a mistake, or you could practice the whole piece all the way through without stopping. So before we go forward, let's make a distinction between these two different types of learning. There's implicit learning and explicit learning. Implicit learning, an example of that is learning when you learn how to ride a bike. When you get on a bike and you start pedaling and riding the bike, can you really explain what you're doing? Like, how are you doing what you do? You just kind of do it. It's implicit, you just kind of do it. You can't explain it, and that's just it. Explicit learning is a type of learning associated with actually thinking about what you're doing. So you can relate this to learning how to hit a tennis ball instead of riding a bike, because with that you have to focus on, okay, what grip am I going to use? Am I going to put a spin on the ball? What direction do I want it to go? How am I going to control where this ball goes? Okay, so yeah, those are the two different kinds of learning that we're going to have to be thinking about going forward. So as you can probably tell, explicit learning is more beneficial to us when we practice. And another word for explicit learning is deliberate practice. And deliberate practice is different from what people normally do. What people normally do is they just keep repeating something until they slowly get better. It's a very painful process. But anyway, deliberate practice is our goal. That's what we want to do. So an example of deliberate practice is basically, let's say I play the first part of my piece and I listen and I think, okay, my first note sounds timid. Then I'm going to think, how do I fix that? And instead of just thinking like, oh, I'm just going to play more confidently, no, that's way too general. You want to come up with a specific solution. So let's say I try, I don't know, let's do a little elbow lean. And then I play it again with my little elbow lean solution. If it works, I'll keep doing that. If it doesn't work, then I have to come up with something else. Maybe I'm going to focus on making my aperture smaller so that the air is more focused. So you have to come up with specific solutions and you have to keep trying and trying. Each repetition should have a purpose, not just mindlessly going through the motions. So that basically boils down to play, reflect, plan, and then repeat. This is a great list to write out so that you remember how to deliberately practice. Hint, hint, wink, wink, you should write this down. So if deliberate practice is better than normal practice, why don't we just do that all the time? Well, there's an illusion going on. There's an illusion afoot. So basically, when you're doing that mindless repetition instead of deliberate practice, there's an illusion that you seem to get better quicker, because when you start off the practice session, you might sound, a little off, a little bad maybe, but then when you keep repeating, you're practicing all these little adjustments and you keep getting better and better. But the problem is when you go back to it the next day, it sounds just like it did the day before when you first started practicing. So we're going to get into how to fix that and how to sound good the first time you play it instead of having to repeat it a bunch of times. So now we're on to our next practice method. This one is unbelievably important. Big chunks versus little chunks. So if, for example, if you have 45 minutes to practice and you need to practice 3 different sections, the obvious answer to people would be, okay, I'm going to do 15 minutes per section to total 45 minutes. But with this type of practice, you will be back at square one the next day. I swear, we've all experienced it. Ask any experienced musician, it's the worst. So instead of doing big chunks, small chunks, little chunks, that's the key. So when you have your 45-minute chunk, all right, you're going to spend 5 minutes on section 1, 5 minutes on section 2, 5 minutes on section 3. Then you're going to go back to section 1, another 5 minutes, section 2, another 5, section 3, another 5. And you do that one more time to total 45 minutes. And you get better more consistently. But why? Why is the question? Because of the information retrieval process. That sounds like a lot of big words, but it makes sense, trust me. So when you do the big chunks, the 15-minute chunks, what happens when you return to it the next day is that you forget what you learned from the previous day, and then you practice again, and then you remember it. The next day you do the same thing. You forget, and then you remember it. But it's just a slow, painful process because it seems to take so long to get better. Weeks, months. But when you practice in small chunks, you basically speed up that forgetting process. So when we do our 5-minute chunks for 45 minutes instead of 15, we do the 5-minute chunks, we are forgetting every time we go back to each section. So we do section 1 for 5 minutes, section 2 for 5 minutes, section 3 for 5 minutes. When you go back to that section 1, you're going to forget what you learned because that's just what we do. We're human. But you're going to practice it for 5 minutes and you're going to remember a little bit. You're going to retrieve the information that you just learned. Section 2, you forgot, but you're going to retrieve that information. Section 3, same thing. Then you're going to go back to section 1 for a 3rd time that day. And you're going to forget because we're human. But you're going to retrieve that information. Section 2, same thing. So you are forgetting and retrieving the information 3 times a day in this specific example instead of just once a day. And you can do even smaller chunks. You can do 2-minute chunks, you could do 3-minute chunks, and it depends on how much time you have. You can do 2-minute chunks for 10 minutes, and still you're better off doing that than doing one giant 10-minute chunk. It's just way better. And fun fact, you can use this technique for literally anything. You can use it for studying for math, studying for English. You can use it in sports, literally anything. Because especially for studying, this is super helpful. You know, are you gonna go over the whole study guide only one time through? No, you're gonna go through, you know, each section multiple times. But when you do it in these chunk methods, you're gonna remember things way easier. It's amazing. The next type of practice is variable practice, and this works on our adaptability as musicians. So let's say you have a really difficult 2-measure passage that you just can't seem to get right. Variable practice is your best friend. So the first thing you could vary is the rhythms. So instead of playing the rhythm as written, you could play it swung, which would sound like 1, a 2, a 3, a 4. Scotch snap, that would sound like the opposite of swing. It would sound like 1E, 2E, 3E, 4E. And then finally you could practice it in triplets, triplet, 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 triplet. And the next variable that is also equally important that people seem to forget about is varying the dynamics. So if something is written piano, play a forte, play a mezzo forte, crescendo it, decrescendo it, do a crescendo, decrescendo, all sorts of combinations. And the third variable is articulations. So play it staccato, play it slurred, play it legato. You can do all sorts of different combinations with that as well. But when you do this variable practice, it makes it so that when you perform, you can adapt on the fly. I specifically remember when I did this audition for an orchestra, I articulated something different than I normally do when I practice, and it messed up my whole audition. I was thinking about that one little thing, and I was like, oh, why did I do that? And then I messed up the entire piece. So, that being said, when you practice all of the articulations or all of the dynamics, all of the rhythms, you're setting yourself up so that no matter what happens in your performance, you can get off of it and you can keep performing without any other mess ups, hopefully. But it makes us more adaptable when we perform. So this is the last form of practice that we can do, performance practice. It is sadly the most neglected form of practice. It's off in a corner without any attention from anybody. So sad. But this is basically why people aren't consistent in performances. Why do we choke when we perform sometimes? You know, sometimes we get nervous, that's part of it, but I think a bigger part is lack of practicing performing. How can we expect to perform well when we only practice performing a week before the concert? You know, it doesn't really make a lot of sense. There's two sides to our brains when we practice. There's the thinking part where we think about and adjust what we want to do. And then there's the doing part where we're creating something, we're performing something, we're creating music, you know? And that's a completely different skill from the adjusting skill. You know, when you perform, you're not going to have 3-4 tries to get it right. You get one try, that's it. That's just as much of a skill to practice as adjusting. So we're going to get into how to practice performing next. So how to practice performing. It might seem silly, but get into the mindset and go through the motions quite literally. Walk into your room, do a bow, imagine an audience clapping, get into that nice, confident playing posture, and play the first 30 to 60 seconds of music. Even when you first start learning a piece, you should do this because it strengthens your confidence and you get more used to performing. And if you really want to feel the mindset of performing, you can always ask a friend or a family member to listen to you play for, 30 to 60 seconds, or you can even go through the whole piece if you're confident enough to do that. But yeah, that is the last practice method that we're going over. Thank you for watching this video. Make sure to write down these practice methods in your practice journals, and I'll see you at school next week.